the meet, it's really a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Dr. Carrie Metlin, who's been the forest ecologist for the Nature Conservancy in Ashland, Oregon since 2010. He earned his PhD in organismal biology and ecology at University of Montana, as well as a master's from the College of Forestry and Conservation. He's got a really impressive publication record, a range of papers on plant communities and fire, so really relevant to today's discussion. I appreciate he's a leader in the field, and when I reached out to him essentially out of the blue, he was willing to take time away from all this other work to talk to us today. And that's part of he engages with diverse partners, as he'll touch on, and really provides that scientific grounding for forest management decisions to think about robust monitoring, ongoing adaptation, and he focuses on southwestern Oregon. So that's, of course, where we're honed in today. So a reminder that you definitely put questions, comments in the chat window. And during the presentation, we'll have everybody muted, but there's time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, put it in the chat window and then we'll make sure to get it addressed. We are recording today, so if you see great information, you think, oh, someone in my office should have seen this, we'll share that recording afterwards and it'll be available out there. I think without further ado, Carrie, you can take it away.
Great, okay. Well, thanks, Xander. And just to confirm, you can see my slideshow and you can hear me fine?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent, that's good. Okay, so as Xander mentioned, my name is Carrie Metlin. I've been working in southwestern Oregon for about 10 years now. And in this very watershed, this is the Ashland Municipal Watershed. There's a ski area up at the top here. Very recent current events, the Alameda fire started over here, sort of at the north and the east edge of town, and then it blew north, fortunately, and west, away from Ashland, but very unfortunately, severely impacting the communities of Talent and Phoenix. And we are still dealing with some serious emerging issues from having fire right in our backyards. But this puts a huge amount of urgency on understanding the work we do, improving the work we do, and basically having landscapes where we as humans can better live with fire in our midst. Here we see an example of a prescribed fire right at the sort of the crest where lightning is highly common in the municipal watershed, and this prescribed fire up here is designed to, as I said, make it easier to handle lightning ignitions as they come then into the municipal watershed, but also to deal with any fires that might be coming up and over that distant ridge line. It's a great little fire. So a lot of my work, here's that ski area I was talking about, is all about basically bringing together partners to think about where we have shared objectives so that we can co-invest for the common good. I'm going to show you a few slides that basically highlight the fact that this is a landscape which is threatened by uncharacteristically severe fire for a number of reasons. That if we can think about what are the many landscape scale or stand scale objectives that we might want to achieve, come together on how to achieve those, and in a way that very much explicitly accounts for fire, we can more effectively collaborate together and have a successful project. The project that I've been working on, the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, Lomacotzi Restoration Project, the City of Ashland, and the Forest Service initially. And then we grew this project from sort of the federal forest core, which is here in the middle, out to city lands and private lands by partnering with the NRCS and Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. This is a model that we see as something that hopefully we can grow to other landscapes. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the rationale, how we ended up sort of investing in this particular landscape, and then some of the approaches and tools that we've started to develop to think more about the larger Rogue Basin, 4.6 million acres that's sort of, all around the Ashland area, and how we're bringing partners to the table to achieve more of this kind of work and live better with fire. So as mentioned earlier, here are, this is a very fire-prone landscape. So here's the Northwest, and this light green color, this is where fire regime group 1, or frequent mild fire, was predominant. And we know from a lot of different sources, dendrochronology, historical records, looking at old data that was collected at the turn of the century, that between Native Americans and lightning, there was a great deal of fire on this landscape. It maintained relatively open conditions, and fire operated in a way that perhaps it doesn't now, and helped maintain that vegetation. Just for reference, this little pine tree is more or less where Ashland's at. So the Rogue Basin, it's a big, huge valley, really. And on one side, you have the Cascade Range on the east. This is a north-south mountain range. And then on the southerly end, you have the Siskiyou Mountains. And then sort of in the middle, you have the interior valley zone. So down low, we have chaparral, oak woodland, and grassland. And then as you get up high, you get up into the alpine zone with true firs, and then eventually no trees at all. Along this increasing gradient of precipitation, decreasing temperature, and increasing productivity, you see that you also have a gradient of fire. So down here lower in the valley, we had historically much more frequent fire. That fire was important for maintaining sort of a dynamic mosaic and improving the resistance and resilience of that system to fire. And we've got a lot of certainty about that. We have a lot of really robust references that allow us to understand that historical dynamic. Up a little higher, we don't have tree species that record fires as well, and I'd say much less is known. We have a lot less certainty about what those historical fire regimes were like, but we do know that they were more variable and they were longer. Based on what we know, we can say that in recent times, despite all of the fires that we've seen in the last few years, this is a landscape that is actually missing fire. And so if we compare the last 30 years of fire to what we would have expected under a historical fire regime, this big gray box is what we might have expected, whereas this red little pancake there, that is what we have actually observed. And so we're seeing a lot less fire than we would have historically. But importantly, where historically we would have seen something like 6 to 9% at high severity, we're seeing much more, 36% at high severity, which of course has really important implications, not just for people, but how the ecology of those forests. I'm really used to giving presentations like this in person. And right now I'm like trying to scan the audience for questioning looks or questions. I'm almost tempted to say, like, if you got a really burning question, just ask it. And you know, we've got plenty of time and we can work through this stuff. But moving along, a change in the fire regime, of course, has very important ramifications for the forest. And so here's another Pacific Northwest wide study that looked at basically proportions of several structural states, or what kind of forest is out there. And they compared the natural range of variability as we would have expected it to what we see now. And if you zoom in on the Rogue Basin down here in the southwest corner, what we see is across 4.2 million forested acres, we have extensive logging, fire exclusion, and recent fires. And these dynamics, combined with grazing and a lot of other factors, have resulted in severely deficit late cirrus forests. So we don't have the old forest, either the late cirrus closed, which is your classic multi-layered forest dominated by big trees, or late cirrus open, your forest which has big trees but lots of gaps and lots of light getting through to a more productive understory. And then if we look across this Rogue Basin landscape, about 50% of it is overly dense and closed. And if we were to disturb it in some way with thinning or burning, that would help develop late cirrus structural classes and actually help make this landscape more resilient to fire. As I may have already mentioned, wildfire risk on this landscape is high. This is contemporary wildfire risk from some fire behavior modeling that was done by the Forest Service and other partners. And all I really want to show here is that the threat to human communities is very real, as we're experiencing, and that in red are the areas of highest risk, southwestern Oregon is among the highest wildfire risks in the Pacific Northwest. No big surprise. But, you know, we don't just care about is there going to be fire and what's it going to do. We also care about things like recovering the northern spotted owl. And all I want to highlight here is from across the range of the northern spotted owl, wildfire risk is actually important for recovering that species. And unfortunately, up into, I believe this was published in 2012, maybe 2015, we were actually losing a lot of really important northern spotted owl habitat to high severity wildfire. And unfortunately, that's been mostly on reserve lands. And so even for important objectives like conserving and protecting our late cereal species, we need to think about wildfire and how wildfire is being delivered to those systems and then allowing them to develop. Oh, come on. And finally, climate change is going to have a huge influence on how these systems develop and how we live with them. And this is a slide that's basically trying to just say, hey, climate change is going to make the fire situation much more real for folks. In the lightest yellow, you see where areas are predicted to see at least a doubling in fire by the end of the century. And in the red, which are relatively small pixels, but you see a bunch of them here in the West Cascades, where we've been seeing a lot of fires recently, 7 to 13 times more fire by the end of the century. And honestly, I'd say these are probably on the low end of some of the predictions. As you can see here, there are a lot of papers that that project increasing fire under climate change. And that's for a lot of reasons. Fortunately, there are lots of different kinds of fire. Here I have a picture of that prescribed fire that we implemented up on the ridge. And then over here, we have the Klamathon fire, a relatively recent wildfire, human ignited and driven by wind. And here are some of the different effects, right? So here's an area where we did some thinning, and then this prescribed underburn really had some nice effects for that we were looking for. And then on the right, this wasn't a cataclysmic event, but this was a high severity fire that burned and it removed a high proportion of the trees. Fortunately, we still have some on that landscape. And then this is just a slide to really drive home the fact that field treatments can work. They don't all the time. As I was saying right at the start, Xander and I were chatting, we're changing probabilities. And so as with probabilities, they're never 100%, outcomes are never guaranteed. But we can change those probabilities, even in the instance of very large fires like the tripod or the rim fire. We've got lots of now published examples of where field treatments on a landscape affect fire outcomes both at that stand and at the landscape scale, and even in stands that weren't treated. So just a quick summary, we've got some problems. Our forests are facing climate change, which is driving up temperatures, increasing drought, and increasing the likelihood of fire. Those landscapes are severely altered, both by contemporary fires, but importantly by our previous land management in a lot of different ways. And those have important implications for what we have to work with and how we're going to get where we want to go. And then finally, the reality that humans are going to be on this landscape and we need some ecosystem services like clean air, water jobs, an expectation of conserving biodiversity and sequestering carbon. And fortunately, we have some management options. Managed fire is a big one because it happens on federal lands even where there aren't roads. Protecting and promoting complex forest habitats is incredibly important. We do this wherever we have species that are dependent on that habitat and where those conditions aren't representing a huge shift from what would have been resilient in historical times. And then finally, on a more limited footprint where we can get to, we have proactive ecological thinning combined with prescribed fire or managed fire to set up resilient conditions and help adapt these forests to climate change. Now, these options will vary. As you can see on this slide, I've tried to show we have a whole mix from a forest that really doesn't need any management through where we've done a lot of mechanical work to remove the commercial trees. Clearly, there's a lot of work remaining to do. Here you can see some logs going out of the woods, and here we have a nice example of the prescribed underburn. And so we can have these objectives of timber production, reducing fuels, restoring forests, adapting forests, mitigating carbon loss, or producing biomass energy. And as I'm trying to show in this Venn-ish diagram, those objectives don't always perfectly overlap. And so we have to have a process for thinking about how to achieve those objectives and get as a society where we want to be. So here's an example of some of the treatments that I am going to be talking about when I say restoration or adaptation. It involves some forest thinning, where you maybe open up some gaps, you keep a lot of clusters, you promote diverse species, but especially early cereal tree species. And that looks a little bit like this in some instances. Big point being that merchantable trees are only part of the restoration. So here would be an example of a stand that we restored where we took out a lot of shade tolerant trees. And at first, here in the commercial, it wasn't done yet. We had to come back and do a non-commercial work and then get fire back in that system. The fire is incredibly important, as I'm sure you all know, because it helps select for more resistant species. It really does a lot to modify forest density and layering, as well as the spatial patterning of the stand, which is hugely important when fire comes back through. And then it stimulates the nutrient cycle. It germinates species. It allows a lot of things to happen that really don't happen if you don't have fire in that system. So the big question, of course, is how much? And where do we do that work? And of course, understanding why. And this is just a diagram of the structured decision-making process that we've been trying to understand. Collaborative engagement has kind of given a lot of information in these green boxes, helping us to refine our landscape objectives, helping us understand our wildfire risk, and develop scenarios that we really care about. That gets combined with what is the existing vegetation, what is the accessibility, and how much money do we have to work with, where are those habitats that we need to protect, so that we can develop scenarios, understand the outputs and outcomes of different scenarios, and come together to make decisions about what we're going to do on that landscape. The landscape I'm talking about is the Rogue Basin. This is 4.6 million acres, 4.2 of which are forested. It is in southwestern Oregon. The Rogue River flows up through here. Not all of this is actually within the Rogue River Basin because the Forest Service and the BLM have some adjacent lands that we went ahead and included in the analysis. I want you to notice that there's a very tight interstitching of Forest Service, BLM, and private, a high level of WUI, and so human and nature are interacting pretty aggressively on this landscape. Here's the team. Under the auspices of the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative, we came together for a lot of meetings to develop the Rogue Basin Cohesive Forest Restoration Strategy. This is a strategy that basically tries to take regional assessments of why you might do work, so landscape scale objectives, distill them down into watershed priorities so that you can think about, if you're going to do the work here, what are the kinds of things that you can achieve? Promotes a process for understanding what you might do, but ultimately we need to come together as partners to delineate unit scale implementation, work to understand what kind of monitoring do we want to do, and then that drives our adaptive management cycle. And hopefully we've got a strong enough system that we can actually feed back in the data from that monitoring, and it can feed back up to those regional assessments so that we can continue to learn and adapt and do a better job as we move forward. Some of the objectives that we might try to achieve with our forest adaptation work: integrating both habitat and protection and proactive restoration. That means we're not just thinking about where we're going to cut down trees, we're also thinking about where it's important to not cut down trees. We're going to use all of the tools, both mechanical treatments and managed fire. We're going to really explicitly think about wildfire risk because it's such a driver in the system, but we're really thinking about how in that context we're going to have enduring viability of lots of different habitats and species. We're going to include human communities in that and think about fire adapted communities. It's never been felt more urgent than now. And then of course we have to think about economics, we need to think about workforce viability, and we need to think about timber infrastructure in order to get that work done. This is kind of a summary of what went into the Rogue Basin strategy and a value. So here would be our 4 landscape objectives: promoting climate resilience, recovering the northern spotted owl, promoting resilient landscapes, and reducing wildfire risk. And then on this side, a little bit about how, and I don't have time to go into this now, but thinking through what are our treatment types, and that really is responsive to the existing vegetation. What is the accessibility? How do we get to it? And so thus what is possible? And then how do we work through knowing what the vegetation is? How can we think about sort of staging that work so that it's doable? We don't have all of these pieces, but we're trying to work towards that so that we can prioritize our project areas. We can be very explicit about the objectives we want to achieve. Thus, we can fund the work, bring partners together to do the work, monitor the work, and move forward. This is an output of the Rogue Basin strategy. These are just priorities on the around the edges. You see planting areas. These are like 50,000 acre planting areas that have been prioritized in the darkest orange for climate resilient landscapes, promoting northern spotted owl, promoting more resilient forests by opening up cereal habitats, addressing large wildfire community risks. So these are the wildfires that are bigger than 30 acres that are moving into communities. And over here, local fire community risk, addressing those fires that are starting in those communities. And then up here we have sort of the integrated index. And so in the yellow through red, what you see is the areas that we've mapped out as treatable and accessible using the data sets that we have available. And then the priority is highest if a particular planning area performs for all of the objectives. So what you can see is it's sort of an integrated prioritization in this particular display, and then priorities for each different landscape scale objective around the outside. And the idea is that we can take these results and we can talk with our partners and figure out why we're doing work, where we're doing work. And we've been doing this in relatively large groups. We've been really trying hard to make sure people understand what we're trying to achieve, but then that they have an opportunity to provide feedback. So this is just an example where we came together with everybody from local politicians to agency heads to talk about how we're going to think about fire, how we can start to kickstart the proactive discussions around wildfire response and preparing for wildfire. Fortunately, I do want to say that there were some tribal members that were involved in this, and integrating that indigenous perspective was a big objective that has not been yet satisfactorily attained, but we're working that way. Basically, we're trying to build political will to do the work. We're trying to identify local opportunities, continue to refine our objectives and what we're doing, engage in a whole lot of education and getting people up to speed, and then, of course, co-investing and getting work done. And here is just a quick snapshot of what we're actually getting done. Unfortunately, you really don't want to try to read those acronyms. What I'll just say is, here's Ashland and the Ashland Forest All Lands Restoration Project. This is the work that's been ongoing for the last 10 years and that I've been the most involved with, and that we're trying to sort of wrap up and get into a maintenance phase. Over here we have the Upper Applegate watershed, and related to it over here, a Shan Apple project. These are projects that we're actively starting to do implementation of restoration and adaptation treatments on using Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board funding. And then these different colored blotches are areas where we're trying to develop a collaborative forest restoration proposal so that that would facilitate work done on federal land. I'll also say that there's a substantial private investment that's making available some funding to do some work, and we've been all summer long we've been talking about the priorities to do work where I just circled. I believe that's the SWIFT project, and so that would bring funding to do work on private lands. And then we're also developing a highly related NRCS conservation implementation strategy, which would again cover a lot of this area, which seems pretty timely given that the Almeda fire just impacted this area in a big way. We also have as he quickly devolved into sort of a sad drawing of, here's another big fire, here's another big fire, and there's another big fire up here. I want to acknowledge there's a lot going on right now, and these fires are very dramatically affecting our communities and basically how we move forward with this work. I want to point out that the Rogue Forest Partners are a group of organizations, you see them here across the bottom, that are really devoted to trying to think this stuff through. We're working with the Rogue Basin strategy to figure out our objectives. We're working together to be more efficient and get this work done on the ground to have better outcomes in the future. And with that, I am happy to take your questions and engage in a lively dialogue.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. The photos, I really enjoyed the maps and photos, very engaging. But as someone away from the region, I have a lot of questions about some of the details. And I'm hoping that other participants will type questions in the chat window, or you're welcome to unmute yourself. We have a small enough group. Yeah, so everyone should be able to unmute. And sometimes if I put something in the chat window, it kind of flashes so everybody knows where it is on their screen. And while we're waiting for other folks to chime in, I'm going to abuse my host privileges and ask the first question. I'm curious, not knowing a lot about the region, but knowing, unlike where I sit here in New Mexico, there is still some timber industry, and we often think, oh boy, if we actually could, sell anything from the woods, we might have more opportunities. And I wonder, Carrie, if you could just touch on that there's a complex relationship between a private company trying to make money in the woods and the resilience work you're talking about. But I guess it seems like there's some positive movement, and maybe you could just expand a little bit on that aspect.
Sure, yeah. I would say that all of the work that I've been involved with shows that there is abundant wood that can go to timber companies to provide jobs, to provide the fiber that we need. That said, as I hopefully was able to get across, there are a lot of different objectives, a lot of different things that we want to achieve on these forests. And so managing just for timber, as an example, might actually limit our ability to perform for wildfire risk or northern spotted owls. So as an example, in the Ashland watershed, we implemented that as a stewardship agreement. We moved 2,000 log truckloads through the community of Ashland. And as far as I know, nobody strenuously objected. In fact, widespread support. And we actually have a social survey of Ashland that showed moderate support at the beginning and strong support after we did take a substantial amount of commercial timber out of that forest. So I think there's a real place for the commercial side of that work, and that it should be going to support communities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I'll just dive a little bit deeper. One of the things I've heard in a number of places, maybe not specifically in this landscape, is some of the challenges of getting fire back on the ground in a good way, where in an area or an ownership where timber production might be a fairly high value, or even the highest, the top priority. Has that come up? Has that been an issue? I mean, I guess underlying this is this basic issue of depending on your markets, if you have charred logs, it's going to reduce your value.
Absolutely. So far, our partners have been the federal government and small private landowners. And so commercial timber hasn't been a strong motivator. What I would say is that when we model out wildfire risk to commercial timber, what we see is that integrating prescribed fire across that landscape can dramatically reduce the wildfire risk to, for example, industrial timberlands. And the other thing I would say is that, yes, if you have a landowner who's really focused on the timber product, you cannot refute the fact that charring stumps and charring those boles will affect the commercial value of the timber. I've also seen, for example, in Missoula, Montana, where uneven age management has been combined with low intensity prescribed fire to maintain very resilient conditions and make money on multiple entries over the course of 20-some years. So I have a strong belief that it's possible, but an acknowledgement that you're going to have to compromise. Your objectives have to fit together pretty neatly for that to be viable.
Yeah, thank you. I think that acknowledgement is maybe the key first step to solution. I'm tempted to, oh good, here we have a question that just came in, or a comment from Carrie. Some of the fires in southwestern Oregon didn't burn forest, but instead communities, really sort of structure fires. And fires burn these areas like a wildfire might burn through a forest. And obviously this is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of your presentation today, Carrie, but given your sort of broad knowledge, do you have any comments about that? Really, it's a sort of a WUI wildland-urban interface question. Yeah. She's curious whether you have suggestions or ideas about dealing with this moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to say hi, Carrie. Good to see you, or hear you, or read your words. But I think it's really important to acknowledge hi, Carrie. There are very different kinds of fire. And absolutely, the Almeda fire, which just dramatically impacted my community, my partners, etc. It was a grass, blackberry, and riparian area and community fire. Those are the things that became entangled. What we've been working to do, starting with Ashland and then building to the All Lands perspective, and becoming engaged in the Rogue Valley Integrated Fire Plan and working increasingly with the fire districts, is acknowledging there's different kinds of fire. It's in different places. There are different people that are responsible for dealing with fire in those different places, but that we're going to be much more effective if we start to talk about it and work together. And so those conversations have very, very much been getting kickstarted. And so I'm absolutely not in a place to say that something should have been done differently in the recent fires that were not in the forest, or that those fires were avoidable. But what I am going to say is that we are working more closely with that cross-section of partners, and that I've seen a lot of really, really good thinking coming together about mapping, for example, houses and their relative flammability. So the cities of Ashland and Medford have done a lot in that regard, so that they can help develop fire-wise and fire-adapted communities more effectively. And these are going to be a key piece of any solution to addressing the bigger landscape. How's that?
Yeah, that's great question. I think that's a really useful answer, Carrie. I mean, there are a lot of unknowns. I put in the chat window a link to the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. It's something I participate in, and I think has some utility in responding to those questions. One of the things we've seen in a number of locations is the importance of the linkage between building fire adapted communities and allowing fire to burn in more wild communities, the back 40, where communities feel ready for fire and smoke. It's their more acceptance of prescribed fire or managing wildfire ignitions. So just a side note. Other questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself. I'll kind of keep an eye out if you unmute, and then shut up for a minute to give you time. Thank you, Carrie, for acknowledging the Carrie. Sorry, yes, Carrie, for acknowledging Carrie for moving forward the presentation, even though the current situation. So, and maybe we could extend that to everybody on the phone. I think it's a tough time for a lot of reasons, and I appreciate everybody for participating.
Dan, it gets confusing with so many carries.
Yeah, sorry.
You know, growing up, it was never a problem, but now, well, there's you, Carrie. And then I actually have a close colleague, Dr. Kemp, who spells her name exactly like mine, and we work for the same organization. So I get the wrong emails all the time. It's become a thing. I feel like a Matt.
I don't know if we're quite there yet, but.
I had another question about management of natural ignitions. I've did some recent research sort of showing particularly in the Southwest, but all across the West, this is, let's see, allowed by some policy changes in 2009 and becoming more and more prevalent. And I wondered, you mentioned it early on in your presentation, but what its sort of relative role you see going forward with some of these projects?
It's a great question. I think it's an important part of the conversation because this work is expensive. And so if we are going to pay for mechanical treatments on the entire landscape, it's going to cost a lot of money. Similarly, if we're going to have little boutique prescribed fires achieving our objectives on a sufficient scale to actually make a difference, again, it's going to be pretty expensive. And so if we can get to a place where we've communicated with the communities, we've worked with the communities so that they're fire adapted, we've worked across the landscape so that we have really clearly delineated operational zones, and we have a lot more certainty than we do now about how those fires are going to either potentially stay contained or how they're going to behave when they start, then we start to be able to manage those fires with basically more options. The other thing I'll say is that in southwestern Oregon, you know, not starting with the Biscuit Fire 2002, it really started in the 90s, but certainly exemplified by the Biscuit Fire 2002 and the profound smoke impacts on the Rogue Valley, and then really ramping up and in the last decade, just phenomenal amounts of fire impact on our communities, and then compounded with COVID. Really strong initial attack has been a high priority. But unfortunately, we know from accumulated evidence from the science that, you know, we can't put out all the fires. So we have to come up with another way forward. And that involves, as we've described with the Rogue Basin strategy, treating about a quarter of the landscape because we can get to it. But then that leaves 3/4 of the landscape where wildfire is going to be the primary change agent. And so that means, can we manage those fires in such a way that we can have more beneficial outcomes? And I think we can learn from Arizona and New Mexico that that's true, that we can manage those fires, because as long as the fires are burning under the hottest and driest conditions because we can't put them out anymore, we're going to have severe effects. But when we can start to use fires under a wider range of fire weathers, then we're going to have a wider range of effects, and they will be more beneficial, and that will improve our ability to manage fire on that landscape in the future. So that was a long answer, but I don't see a lot of people shouting to ask questions, so I went ahead and went for it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and a good answer. I think that sounds right to me. Well, I'll leave a little bit of space here for any last questions, but we also don't need to keep going if we've kind of covered the meat of what we wanted to. And I think one of the important things, Carrie, is you're pointing to some resources, and I'll share when I share out the recording, like the link you have on this page, so that people can dig in for more information. So essentially, last call for questions, or go ahead and unmute yourself. I don't want to cut things off prematurely, but I do, you know, we all, I'm sure, have other things to get to if we've plumbed the depths here. Okay. Well, thanks so much again, Carrie, for taking the time. And also thank you for all the work. To Carrie's point earlier, I mean, what you talked about in 40 minutes, really, you've touched on so many years of work, your own and others. It's reassuring to me how much effort is going in to protect places that I haven't gotten to see yet. So thank you.
My pleasure. Come on up and visit anytime.
As soon as COVID is gone, yes. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close it off, and you'll get an email from me as soon as I can with a link to the recording, etc. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Andrew.